The wind howled through the night like a wild animal, shaking the windows of the small wooden cottage at the edge of the mountain town. Snow was falling so heavily that the world outside looked like a white blur. Inside the cottage, a soft yellow light glowed from a single lamp, and the fireplace crackled, filling the room with warmth. An elderly lady sat in her rocking chair, knitting a woolen scarf and listening to the storm rage outside. She had seen many winters in her life, but this one felt colder, heavier, lonelier. She had lived alone since her husband passed away years ago. The cottage still held his memories, the old coat hanging by the door, his photograph on the mantel, and his favorite mug sitting by the window. Every winter she felt his absence the most. Still, she managed to stay busy, tending to her small garden, feeding the birds, and baking pies for the neighbors. But that night, as the wind screamed and snow piled higher against the door, there was something different in the air, something that felt uneasy. The clock ticked past midnight when she heard it, the faint rumble of engines in the distance. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sound grew louder, closer, and stranger. Who would be out in a storm like this? She stood up slowly, setting her knitting aside, and moved toward the window. Through the frosty glass, she saw blurry beams of light moving down the narrow road. Headlights, dozens of them, weaving uncertainly through the snow. Her heart pounded. She could barely make out shapes, dark figures on large motorcycles struggling against the wind. The engines sputtered and coughed one after another before falling silent. Then came the sound of heavy boots crunching in the snow. Whoever they were stranded. The old lady's hands trembled for a moment. The storm outside was merciless, and she knew that without shelter, no one could survive the night. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and unlatched it. The cold rushed in like a wave, biting her face and hands, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped outside, her old shawl flapping in the wind, and called out, "Come inside. You'll freeze out here." At first, there was no response. Then, through the blinding snow, a tall man appeared, his beard frosted white, his eyes wide with surprise. Behind him stood more figures, rough, leather-clad men, all shivering and covered in snow. Their bikes stood half-buried on the roadside. The old lady didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and motioned toward her door. "Come in," she said again, her voice firm but kind. The men hesitated. They weren't used to being welcomed anywhere, especially not by someone like her. Small, fragile, and fearless. Finally, one of them nodded, and they began to file inside, stamping their boots and shaking off snow. The warmth of the fire hit them immediately, and a faint smell of cinnamon filled the air. The woman hurried to the kitchen, filling a large pot with water and setting it to boil. The living room soon looked like a strange scene. 15 burly bikers sitting awkwardly on the floor and furniture, steam rising from their jackets, their gloved hands rubbing together for warmth. The woman moved among them as if they were her own children, handing out towels, pouring tea, and ladling soup into bowls. "Eat before it gets cold," she said, smiling softly. The men exchanged puzzled looks, unused to kindness that asked for nothing in return. One of them finally spoke, his voice rough from the cold. "Ma'am, you don't even know who we are." She looked at him and smiled again. "I don't need to. I can see you're freezing." The room fell quiet after that. The storm outside roared on, but inside the tension began to melt like ice. The men started to relax, removing their gloves and jackets, letting the warmth sink in. Some of them helped feed the fire, while others sat close together, talking in low voices. The woman moved slowly but surely, serving more soup, bringing out bread, and making sure everyone was comfortable. As they ate, the bikers noticed the pictures on her wall, black and white photos of a young couple standing next to an old motorcycle, smiling under the summer sun. "Your husband rode too?" one of them asked. The old lady's eyes softened. "He did. Loved his bike more than the car. Said the road felt like freedom." The men nodded in understanding. For the first time, they felt a strange connection to this little house and the woman who had opened it to them. They began to share their own stories, long rides, broken engines, people they'd lost, and places they'd seen. She listened quietly, nodding, laughing at their jokes, sometimes wiping a tear from her eye. Outside, the storm grew wilder, but the house was filled with warmth and laughter. The bikers, who looked so fierce to strangers, now sat around the fire telling stories, helping the old lady fix a broken window draft, and washing dishes after dinner. She didn't treat them like outsiders. She treated them like family. Around 2 in the morning, the wind finally began to die down. The snow was still falling, but more gently now. Some of the bikers dozed off on the floor, wrapped in blankets she had pulled from her closets. One of them offered to keep the fire going through the night, saying he was used to staying up late on long rides. The woman smiled, grateful for the company. Before going to bed, she paused for a moment to look at them. These rough men who, only hours ago, had been strangers in the storm. They looked peaceful now, their tough faces softened by sleep and the flickering light. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks before going to her room. The night passed slowly but safely. When dawn broke, pale sunlight crept across the snow-covered fields. The world outside looked like it had been frozen in time. The old lady stepped outside to see the aftermath. Snow piled up to her knees, the road buried, the bikes half hidden beneath white blankets. She smiled, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, the sound of movement came from inside as the bikers began to wake. They stretched, yawned, and thanked her for the shelter. One of them offered to chop wood for her stove. Another started clearing the porch with a shovel he found outside. She tried to protest, but they wouldn't hear it. "You saved our hides last night," one said. "Least we can do is clear your path." The woman chuckled. "I didn't save anyone. You just needed a bit of warmth." As they worked together, the sun rose higher, glinting off the snow and lighting the scene in soft gold. The storm had passed, but something beautiful had been left behind. A quiet bond between people who never would have met otherwise. The old woman felt a strange joy she hadn't known in years. Later, when they were ready to leave, the bikers lined up their motorcycles one by one, engines rumbling back to life. Before they rode off, their leader stepped forward, taking her hand gently. "We'll never forget this," he said. "You'll see us again." She smiled, not really expecting it. "Safe travels," she replied, her eyes glistening in the morning light. As they disappeared down the snowy road, the sound of their engines faded into the distance. The woman stood on her porch for a long while, the wind tugging at her scarf, and whispered softly, "He would have liked them," thinking of her late husband. Then she turned back inside, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the fire. She had no idea that her small act of kindness that night had already started to travel, carried by the roar of engines, the echo of gratitude, and the memory of a warm light in the middle of a storm. The morning sun crept through the snow-covered branches, turning the frozen landscape into a field of glittering diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving behind an almost perfect silence. Inside the little wooden house, the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread drifted through the air. The elderly lady moved quietly between the kitchen and the living room, humming an old tune as she set plates on the table. The night before had felt like a dream. 15 rugged bikers stranded in a blizzard, sitting around her fireplace like lost children finding their way home. She smiled softly as she remembered how careful they had been, afraid to touch anything, speaking in low voices as if they didn't want to disturb her peace. It was strange how quickly fear could turn into comfort when kindness stepped in. She peeked into the living room now, where most of them were still half asleep, wrapped in blankets, boots drying near the fire. One of them was already awake, standing by the window staring at the white morning. "Coffee's ready," she said gently. He turned, a little surprised that she was still treating them as guests. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. She chuckled. "I didn't have to open my door either, but I did. Once I start something, I finish it properly." Soon the rest of them were up, stretching, talking softly, trying not to make a mess. Their voices filled the small house, deep and rough, but not unkind. They thanked her again and again for letting them stay. She simply waved her hand. "No need for thanks," she said. "A person should never close their door on someone who needs help." They ate breakfast together, bread, eggs, and hot coffee that steamed in the cold air. The bikers seemed unsure how to act. They weren't used to being welcomed into someone's home like this. Some of them looked around at the old pictures on the wall, the faded curtains, the handmade rugs. The woman could see the curiosity in their eyes, but she didn't mind. "This house has been in my family for 50 years, she told them. "Every mark, every scratch, it tells a story." After breakfast, a few of them offered to help her clear the snow. She tried to protest at first, but they were already pulling on their jackets and boots. Soon the sound of shovels scraping against ice filled the air. The woman stood by the doorway watching as the big men worked together to dig out her driveway. their laughter echoing through the frosty air. She hadn't heard laughter like that in a long time. Inside, 2 others stayed behind to help clean. They washed dishes and tidied up, careful not to break her old cups. The woman moved among them, still smiling, still calm. "You boys must be tired of people thinking the worst of you," she said. One of them looked down. "Yeah, most people don't even look at us, ma'am. They just cross the street or lock their doors." "Well," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I guess they've forgotten what a person really looks like. You can't judge a soul by what it wears." The man looked at her for a long moment, then nodded quietly. By noon, the snow had stopped falling, and the sky had turned a pale blue. The bikers stood outside, their engines half buried but slowly coming back to life as they brushed off the ice. The woman brought out a tray with mugs of warm tea, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. They accepted them with shy smiles and grateful eyes. "Looks like we'll be able to ride soon," one of them said, testing the throttle on his bike. She nodded. "Good, you've got a long way ahead, but take it slow. The roads will still be slippery." There was a strange sadness in the air, the kind that comes when people who met by chance suddenly realize they might never see each other again. They had come into her life as strangers, rough and loud, but now they stood like friends at her gate. Before leaving, one of them handed her a folded leather patch with their emblem stitched in red and silver. "Keep this," he said softly. "If you ever need us, show it to anyone who rides like we do. They'll find us." The woman smiled and took it carefully, running her fingers over the rough stitching. "That's very kind," she said, "but I hope I'll never need to call anyone for help. I've got everything I need right here." The man smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's still good to know someone's got your back." When the first few engines started, the sound shook the quiet morning. The woman stood by the porch, holding her shawl close around her shoulders, watching as the line of bikes slowly pulled onto the road. They waved at her as they rode off, the sound of their engines echoing between the snow-covered hills until it faded into the distance. After they were gone, the silence returned. But it didn't feel empty. She looked down at the patch in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging, of having done something that truly mattered. She went back inside and placed the patch beside her husband's old photo. "You'd have liked them," she whispered. "They reminded me of you." The day passed slowly after that. She spent the afternoon tending to small chores, sweeping the floor, refilling the wood box, and feeding the birds that gathered outside her window. Every now and then she would glance at the road, half expecting to see one of the bikers return, but the road stayed empty. Still, she smiled every time she thought of how they had laughed around her table, how they had shoveled snow without being asked, how gentle they had been in her home. By evening, she sat by the fire again, her knitting in her lap, the house filled with quiet warmth. She thought about the world beyond her little town, the roads, the noise, the people always in a hurry. It had been years since she'd gone far from home. Life had slowed down after her husband's passing, but that night had reminded her how full of surprises the world could still be. The next few days were calm. The townspeople came by, curious about what had happened. Some of them had seen the motorcycles outside her house that night and assumed trouble. One of her neighbors, a woman who often brought her groceries, asked carefully, "Weren't you afraid?" The old lady shook her head. "Afraid of what?" "Well," the neighbor said, "you know, those people." The woman smiled kindly. "Those people are just people, cold, tired, and human like the rest of us." The neighbor didn't quite know what to say. She had expected a story about fear or chaos, not kindness and laughter. Soon the story spread through the town anyway, how the old lady had opened her door to 15 bikers in the middle of a snowstorm and lived to tell about it. Some called her brave, others called her foolish, but she didn't care. She just went on living her simple life, baking her pies and feeding her birds. But even she couldn't have guessed what was coming next. A week later, just as the last of the snow began to melt, she woke to a strange sound, a deep rumbling in the distance, faint but steady. She stepped out onto her porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. The morning air was still cold, and the sound was getting louder. At first she thought it was thunder again, but then she realized it was engines. Not one, not 10, but many. She shaded her eyes and looked down the long road that led to her house. Far in the distance, black dots began to appear, growing larger as they moved closer. Her heart skipped. The sound of engines grew deeper, like rolling waves. She counted dozens, then more. It couldn't be. But it was. Motorcycles. Dozens upon dozens of them. The old lady stood frozen for a moment, the wind tugging at her hair. The engines grew louder until the air itself seemed to vibrate. She stepped off her porch, staring in disbelief as the line of bikes stretched as far as she could see. They slowed as they neared her home, the riders pulling to a stop one by one, their engines rumbling softly in unison. The quiet mountain road that had seen nothing but snow for weeks was now lined with chrome and leather, shining under the pale sun. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. They had come back. Not just the 15 she had helped, but many more, their brothers, their friends, people she had never seen before. And though she didn't yet know what they had come to do, she could already feel it deep in her heart. Something powerful, something grateful, something beautiful was about to unfold, all because one old woman had opened her door on a cold, stormy night. The sound of hundreds of engines filled the air like thunder rolling through the valley. It grew louder and louder until the little house trembled. The elderly lady stood frozen on her porch, one hand on the railing, her eyes wide in disbelief. The quiet road in front of her home, usually empty except for the mail truck or a passing farmer, was now lined with motorcycles from end to end. Their chrome parts glinted under the pale sunlight, and clouds of white breath rose from the riders as they shut off their engines one by one. The roar faded, replaced by a deep silence. The only sound was the crunch of boots on snow as the bikers began to gather in front of her gate. Some wore heavy leather jackets with patches and symbols. Others carried helmets under their arms, their faces rough from long hours on the road. The woman stood still for a moment, her heart beating fast, not out of fear but out of astonishment. She didn't know what to say. She clutched her shawl and stepped forward. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. The man in front, a tall figure with snow on his shoulders, nodded respectfully. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "Hope we're not disturbing you." She shook her head slowly. "Not at all, but what is all this?" He smiled slightly. "You remember a few nights ago the storm? 15 of our brothers got stuck out here. You opened your home to them when no one else would. Word got around." The woman blinked, still trying to take it all in. "So all these people came because of that?" The man nodded. "We don't forget kindness, ma'am, especially when it's rare." Behind him, the other bikers stood quietly, some holding bags, others carrying boxes. The woman's front yard, which usually saw nothing more than bird tracks, was now full of people and motorcycles. She looked around, completely overwhelmed. "What on earth are you all doing here?" she asked, half laughing, half shocked. The man motioned to the group behind him. "We came to say thank you. You took care of our brothers like they were your own family. We wanted to return that." Before she could respond, a few of them stepped forward and began unloading supplies. Boxes of canned food, firewood, bags of groceries, even a small generator. The woman gasped and shook her head. No, this is too much." "You don't have to do this," one of the bikers smiled warmly. "You gave what you had that night, ma'am. Now we're giving what we can." Tears filled her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. She simply covered her mouth and watched as they worked together, moving quietly, respectfully, like an organized army of gratitude. Some were stacking firewood by her shed. Others were fixing the fence that had been leaning since last winter. A few of them swept her porch and cleared the path that was still slippery with ice. The woman stood there watching, her heart full. She had spent years in quiet solitude, used to doing everything on her own, and now all at once her yard was full of life and laughter. After a while, she invited them inside for tea. The house, which had felt so empty for so long, was suddenly warm with chatter and laughter again. The men took turns stepping in, careful not to crowd the place. Some leaned against the doorway, others sat near the fire, their large hands wrapped around delicate cups that looked too small for them. "This is really good tea," one of them said, smiling. The woman chuckled. "It's just tea, dear." "Maybe," another one said, "but it tastes better when you've got a good reason to drink it." The laughter that followed made her heart swell. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had missed the sound of people, the sound of life. When they finished, the leader of the group stood up. "We've got something else for you," he said. He motioned for another rider to bring something in. The man returned carrying a small wooden box, polished and carved with beautiful designs. He placed it on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked softly. Open it, the leader said. She hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a small silver plaque, engraved with words that made her eyes well up again. To the woman who opened her door when the world was cold. From your friends on the road. She touched the letters with trembling fingers. This is too kind, she whispered. I don't deserve this, the man smiled. Yes, you do. You showed us that kindness still exists. Sometimes we ride hundreds of miles and all we see is fear in people's eyes. You reminded us that there's still goodness out there. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. The old lady felt something she hadn't felt in years, and not just gratitude, but connection. These men, who the town probably whispered about, had brought warmth to her heart in ways she couldn't describe. They stayed for hours that day, fixing things around her property and sharing stories. She learned that some of them had families waiting at home. Others lived on the road most of the year. They told her about the places they'd been, the people they'd met, the long rides under open skies. In return, she shared memories of her husband, how he used to take her riding through these same hills when they were young. The men listened with quiet respect, their tough faces softening as she spoke. By afternoon, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the snow on the roof. The air smelled fresh and clean. The bikers had finished their work and the house looked brighter, stronger, almost new. Before they left, the leader stepped forward again. Ma'am, he said, we're not good at saying things fancy, but we mean what we do. You've got a family now, a big one. Anytime you need something, you let us know. We'll be here faster than the snow can fall. The woman smiled through her tears. You've already done more than enough. I can't thank you enough, he nodded. You already did. That night. As they prepared to leave, she noticed the townspeople gathering at the end of the road, watching the scene from a distance. Curious faces peeked from behind fences and windows. The same people who had whispered about her decision to take in bikers during the storm now stood speechless, watching 100 of them quietly line up their motorcycles in perfect formation. The engines started again, their sound echoing across the hills. The leader gave a small salute before putting on his helmet. Take care, ma'am. We'll come by again. I'll hold you to that, she said with a smile. Then, one by one, the motorcycles began to move. The sound rose again, deep and powerful, but this time it didn't feel wild or frightening. It felt alive, like a song carried by the wind. The woman stood at her gate, waving as they disappeared down the road, the sound fading until only silence remained. When it was all over, she looked around at what they had done. The stacked wood, the repaired fence, the shining new generator near the shed. Her heart felt heavy and full all at once. She walked back into her house, her steps slow but light, and placed the wooden box with the silver plaque next to her husband's picture. As she sat in her rocking chair that evening, watching the last bit of sunlight fade from the snow, she couldn't stop smiling. The house, once lonely and quiet, now felt filled with something invisible, something that lingered long after the roar of engines was gone. That night, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The road was empty again, but it no longer felt lonely. The light from her lamp glowed softly across the snow, just as it had that night of the storm. Only this time her heart was warmer. She whispered softly into the quiet room, maybe kindness really does travel faster than the wind. And though no one else was there to hear it, she could almost imagine the distant hum of engines answering her, far away in the mountains. A sound of gratitude carried by the road, reminding her that one small act of kindness can reach places you never expect. The days after the visit passed quietly, yet the little house didn't feel empty anymore. Every corner carried the memory of laughter, the faint smell of oil and leather, the echo of rumbling engines fading down the snowy road. The woman often found herself smiling for no reason, remembering the sight of those big men fixing her fence, stacking her firewood, and sitting in her small living room like a bunch of old friends. It was as if they had left behind a part of their warmth with her. The neighbors still talked about what had happened. Some came by pretending to bring her pie or milk, but really they wanted to hear the story again. They couldn't believe she had let all those bikers into her house. Weren't you scared? One woman asked again, eyes wide with curiosity. The old lady simply shook her head. Fear doesn't help anyone in a storm, she said softly. And kindness doesn't hurt anyone either. The neighbor didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded awkwardly. For the old woman, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. She swept her porch every morning, fed the birds that gathered near her steps, and cooked simple meals in her small kitchen. But something inside her had changed. The house felt more alive somehow. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way the sunlight came through the window just right in the morning, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Even her old cat seemed happier, spending more time curled near her feet instead of hiding in corners. One afternoon, while she was knitting by the fire, she heard the faint rumble of an engine in the distance. Her heart skipped, but when she looked out the window, she saw only a single rider making his way up the snowy road. He parked in front of her gate and removed his helmet, his breath rising in white clouds. She recognized him instantly, one of the men who had stayed that stormy night. He smiled when he saw her at the door. "Hope I'm not bothering you, ma'am," he said. "Not at all," she replied, smiling back. "Come in before you freeze out there." He stepped inside, brushing snow off his jacket. "The boys wanted me to stop by," he said. "We just wanted to make sure you're okay. The weather's turning again next week, and we figured you might need anything before it hits." She felt a warm tug in her heart. "That's kind of you," she said. "But I'm doing fine. Thanks to all of you, I have enough supplies to last the whole season." He nodded, glancing around the cozy room. The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the walls. "They'll be glad to hear that," he said. "You've got a lot of people who care about you now, you know that?" The woman chuckled. "That's a funny thing to hear at my age. But I'll take it." They talked for a while, about the weather, the town, the roads. The writer told her about the places he and his group had been since that day, the small towns they passed through, and the people who had heard about her story. "You wouldn't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "People talk about you everywhere we go. They call you the lady with the open door." She laughed softly, a bit embarrassed. "Oh, nonsense. I just made soup and gave them a place to sleep." "That's not nonsense, ma'am," he said. "That's rare." When he left later that afternoon, he promised to stop by again when the snow melted. She watched him ride away until the sound of his engine faded into the hills, then went back inside, her heart full again. Weeks went by, and the snow began to soften under the sun. Birds returned, and patches of green began to show through the melting white. The old lady spent more time outside now, walking slowly along the road, her cane tapping against the damp ground. The world felt new again. One morning she found a letter in her mailbox. It was written on thick paper with a simple message: "Keep your door open." The road never forgets. It wasn't signed, but she knew who it was from. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the small wooden box the bikers had given her. Every now and then, she'd see a lone motorcycle pass her house. Sometimes the rider would slow down, give a quick wave, then continue on. She didn't always recognize them, but she waved back anyway. It felt like her little piece of the world had stretched beyond her quiet road, as if the kindness she had offered that night had rippled out far beyond what she could see. The town, too, had started to change. People talked less harshly about the bikers now. A few weeks after the visit, a local diner put up a small sign near the counter that read, "Kindness rides far." It became a saying in the town, a quiet reminder that you never really know who someone is until you show them a bit of grace. One spring evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the old lady sat on her porch sipping tea. The air was cool, but the snow had almost disappeared, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and pine trees. She was thinking about her husband again, about how much he had loved to ride, and how proud he would have been to see what happened. She looked down at the small patch of leather the bikers had given her that first day. The symbol stitched on it had begun to fade a little from her touching it so often. She smiled and pressed it against her chest. "You'd laugh at me for all this fuss," she whispered. "But maybe this is your doing somehow." She went inside as the evening deepened. Later that night she was woken by another sound. Not thunder, not engines, but something gentle. Music, faint at first, like a whisper. She pulled on her shawl and went to the window. Down the road, a small group of riders had stopped near her gate again. They had set up lanterns on the ground, their light glowing softly in the darkness. One of them strummed a guitar and the other stood silently listening. The melody was simple and slow, full of peace. She opened the door and stepped out, her slippers crunching on the gravel. One of the men waved. "Evening, ma'am," he called out. She smiled. "Evening, boys." "You're out late." "Just passing through," he said. "Thought we'd stop by, play a tune for you." She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, smiling, as the sound of the guitar floated through the cool night air. It wasn't loud, but it carried a soft, steady rhythm that blended with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the trees. When the song ended, one of them stepped forward and handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Picked these on the road," he said shyly. She took them gently, her heart swelling again. "You boys never stop surprising me," she said. "Neither did you, ma'am," another one said with a grin. They chatted for a few minutes, and then the riders started their engines again. Before leaving, one of them turned back. "We'll be around, you know. The road always leads back home." She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Then I'll keep the light on," she said. When they left, she went back inside, placing the flowers in a jar by the window. She sat down and listened to the night for a long time. The air was quiet again, but not empty. It carried something invisible, something that felt like love, loyalty, and remembrance. The next morning, she woke early to the sound of birds outside her window. Sunlight streamed into the room, landing on the little table by her chair where the wooden box, the letter, and the leather patch lay together. She smiled softly, realizing that she wasn't just an old woman in a small house anymore. Somehow, in some strange way, she had become part of a much bigger story, one that moved across roads, across towns, across hearts. And every time she heard the faint rumble of an engine in the distance, she would look up from her knitting and whisper to herself, "They're still out there." It was no longer just noise to her. It was a reminder that kindness once given never truly leaves. It rides on mile after mile, carried by those who were touched by it. And even though the storms would come again, she knew her door would always stay open, just like her heart. Spring slowly turned to summer, and the little town tucked between the hills bloomed with life again. The snow that once blanketed the roads had long melted away, revealing winding paths that led out to green meadows and clear skies. The old woman's house stood quietly by the roadside, surrounded by wildflowers and tall grass swaying in the warm breeze. To anyone passing by, it looked like any ordinary home, but those who knew its story would often slow down when they passed, sometimes even stop and smile. It had been months since that unforgettable winter storm, yet the memory remained as fresh as the morning dew. For the old woman, it wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a part of her life. She still received letters now and then. Some were from the riders she had sheltered, others from strangers who had heard about her kindness and wanted to say thank you. They came from all over the country, little postcards from faraway towns, sometimes even photographs of roads, sunsets, or bikes parked beside long stretches of highway. She kept them all in a small box by the fireplace. Whenever she felt lonely, she would sit by the fire and read them one by one, smiling at the thought of how a simple act on a cold night had reached so many hearts. One afternoon, she was out tending to her small garden when she heard the familiar rumble of engines in the distance. At first, she thought it was just someone passing through, but the sound grew louder and steadier. She looked up, squinting under the bright sun, and what she saw made her drop her watering can. Down the road, a line of motorcycles was approaching. Not one or two this time, but dozens. The engines roared together, echoing through the valley like thunder rolling over the hills. She stepped back, hand on her chest, as the riders came closer. Their bikes gleamed in the sunlight, polished and shining, each one carrying a small flag tied to the back. They slowed down as they reached her house and parked neatly along the roadside one after another, until it looked like a parade of chrome and leather stretching down the lane. Then one of the riders, a tall man with silver hair and a kind smile, took off his helmet and walked toward her. She recognized him at once. He was one of the first who had arrived that stormy night months ago, the one who had helped her fix the firewood and clean up the snow. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said warmly. "Hope we're not intruding." She shook her head in disbelief, her eyes shining. "Intruding? My goodness, look at all of you. What brings you here?" He looked around, then smiled softly. "We just came to say thank you, and properly this time. You gave us a roof when no one else would. We figured it was time we gave something back." Before she could respond, the rest of the group began unloading things from their bikes. Boxes, paint cans, wood planks, tools. She watched as they moved with purpose, talking and laughing as they worked. One of them came over and explained, "We wanted to fix up your place a bit. Paint the house, repair the fence, maybe clean up that old barn. Hope that's okay with you?" The old woman could hardly speak. "You don't have to do all that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We know," the silver-haired man said gently. "That's why we want to." The next few hours were filled with energy and laughter. The quiet little home buzzed with life again, engines idling softly, hammers tapping, paintbrushes swiping. Some of the bikers trimmed the overgrown grass, others repaired the wooden fence, while a few patched up the roof that had been leaking since last winter. The old woman moved among them, handing out lemonade, cookies, and small plates of sandwiches. She couldn't stop smiling. "You boys are turning my old place into a palace," she said, chuckling as she watched one of them climb a ladder to paint the eaves. "Can't have the lady with the open door living in a house that needs fixing," one of them said, with a grin. The sun began to sink behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The bikers gathered in her yard, sweaty and tired but smiling proudly at their work. The fence looked new again. The barn stood upright and her house gleamed with a fresh coat of white paint. The silver-haired man came up beside her and said softly, "You've done more for us than you know. You reminded us that kindness still exists out here on the road." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "And you reminded me that appearances can be deceiving. The world still has good people. Sometimes they just come wearing leather jackets." They both laughed quietly. As evening fell, they lit a small bonfire in her yard. The bikers gathered around, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, the flames flickering against the twilight sky. The old woman sat on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching them. They looked rough and tough, but in that light they seemed peaceful, like a family that had found its way back home. One of the younger riders brought over his guitar and started playing softly. The tune floated through the air, gentle, comforting, and full of life. Some of them sang along. Others just sat quietly, listening. The old woman closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire and the music fill her heart. After a while, the silver-haired man stood and spoke, his voice steady. "We've been on the road a long time, all of us. Seen a lot of places, met a lot of people. But that night, the one we spent here, it reminded us what family feels like. And family doesn't forget." He gestured toward the row of bikes lined up by the road. "We ride together always. And now, wherever we go, we tell your story. Not just about a storm in a house, but about how kindness changes people. You gave us warmth that night, and we've carried it ever since." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say, so she simply whispered, "Thank you." The riders nodded quietly. Then, as if on cue, they all stood and started their engines. The night came alive with the roar of motorcycles, powerful yet somehow beautiful. One by one, they lined up along the road again. Before leaving, the silver-haired man turned back and handed her something. A small leather vest, perfectly sized for her. On the back, stitched carefully in silver thread, were the words, "Honorary Angel." She gasped softly, her hand trembling as she touched the letters. "Oh my," she murmured. "I can't accept this." "You already did," he said with a gentle smile. "You earned it." He stepped back, gave a small salute, and revved his engine. The rest followed, their headlights flickering to life one by one until the entire road was lit up like a moving river of light. The roar grew louder as they rode off into the distance, disappearing beyond the curve of the hill. When the last sound faded, the night fell silent again. The old woman stood on her porch for a long time, holding the vest against her chest. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter that night. The next morning, the neighbors came by, wide-eyed at the sight of her freshly painted home and the long tire marks left on the road. "Did something happen here?" one of them asked. The old woman smiled softly, her eyes still glimmering. "Just some friends passing through," she said. They didn't quite understand, but she didn't feel the need to explain. Some things didn't need to be. Later that day, she hung the vest on the wall above her fireplace. It looked perfect there, catching the glow of the flames just right. She stood for a long time, looking at it, remembering every sound, every face, every laugh from the night before. And though the house was quiet again, it didn't feel lonely. The warmth of that day, of their friendship, their gratitude, their laughter, stayed with her. It was in the air she breathed, the floorboards under her feet, the very walls that surrounded her. She smiled, whispering to herself, "The road never forgets." And deep down, she knew that somewhere out there those riders were telling her story again, reminding others that even in the coldest storm, a single open door can change everything.